As World War II got underway, both the Allies and the Germans were looking for the knockout blow, the new weapon that would decisively defeat the enemy. For Hitler's Germany, the problem was that Britain was an island. His tanks couldn't blitzkrieg across the Channel. The only way to defeat her was to strangle her seaborne supply routes. That meant warships, and above all, submarines. For the Western Allies, the problem was attacking Germany when there were no Allied troops in mainland Europe. The solution they adopted was strategic bombing. Aerial bombardment aimed at destroying Germany's infrastructure and pounding its people into submission. The two sides had adopted two very different tactics, but with one aim: to save their troops and to bring the war to an end as quickly as possible. Ironically, it was the Germans who first started strategic bombing. In August 1940, Luftwaffe bombers accidentally hit London. The RAF retaliated by bombing Berlin. By the autumn, Germany was bombing Britain's cities almost daily, convinced the British would eventually crack. But the Blitz, as it was called, never showed any sign of forcing the British to surrender. And by the summer of 1941, it was dying away as the Luftwaffe turned its attention to the war in Russia. But for the British military command, bombing remained the only way of striking directly at Hitler's Germany. Moreover, by early 1941, the RAF was starting to receive a new generation of bigger, more powerful, four-engined bombers. These could carry loads of up to 18,000 pounds of bombs, 4 times the capacity of earlier aircraft. The first of these was the Short Stirling. To begin with, the plan was not to hit the German population, but specific infrastructure targets, cutting transport and oil supplies, damaging Germany's ability to wage war. But it suffered one central problem. Britain's bombing was extremely inaccurate. In August 1941, a secret British report showed that over the crucial German Ruhr industrial area, only 10% of British bombers were getting their bombs within 5 miles of their target. At the same time, the German air defenses were taking a terrible toll on British planes. By late 1941, up to 10% of the bombers on any raid were being shot down, a loss rate which couldn't be sustained. The Royal Air Force High Command decided to change tactics. It gave up any pretense of trying to hit specific targets. Instead, Bomber Command was instructed to undertake what it called area bombing, a euphemism for what is known today as carpet bombing. The idea was to deliberately target an entire area of a city, regardless of the civilian population. In the chilling words of the British Air Ministry, it would destroy the morale of the civilian population and, in particular, of industrial workers. Its leading exponent was Air Marshal Sir Arthur "Bomber" Harris, who was now appointed Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command.
There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
In spring 1942, Harris launched what was, in effect, a huge public relations stunt for what he preferred to call strategic bombing. He gathered every available aircraft in Bomber Command. Over 1,000 took off for the German city of Cologne. The city's defenses were overwhelmed. 600 acres were destroyed. But only 39 British aircraft were lost. Harris had won his point. He now had the full support of the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He also now had an outstanding new weapon, the Avro Lancaster, the finest heavy night bomber of the war. And he had a new partner. By the summer of 1942, the United States had joined the air war in Europe. American planes began to appear in Britain. The majority were the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. It was heavily armed with 13 machine guns and could, in theory, fight its way through to a target in daylight without a fighter escort. It was also equipped with a new bomb sight that would supposedly allow it to drop its bombs with almost unerring precision. These features encouraged the Americans to ignore the lessons of the early British campaign and return to targeted raids on Germany's infrastructure. In August 1942, the Americans put the Flying Fortress to the test. 12 of them attacked marshalling yards near Rouen in France. Damage was slight, but the United States lost no aircraft. For the Americans, it was the proof that daylight raids on infrastructure targets could work. For the British, it simply showed that the Americans could hit a minor and relatively undefended target. But that winter, the two allies agreed to combine their approaches. They would launch a massive bombing campaign against Germany's industrial heartland. The Americans would attack by day against carefully selected infrastructure targets. The British would attack by night, carpet bombing whole areas, destroying war production and civilian morale. They hoped it would be so devastating, it might even bring the war to an end. In March 1943, British planes took off for the German industrial city of Essen. High-speed Mosquito light bombers went in first, dropping flares to highlight the targets. Then a force of nearly 450 Lancaster bombers swept over the city, dropping their loads. The German defenses were overpowered. Only 14 British aircraft were shot down. The Essen raid was followed by wave after wave of similar attacks on industrial towns in the Ruhr. But the German air defenses now began to get the measure of the Allied attacks. Britain's losses climbed to 1 in 10. Harris was forced reluctantly to call a halt to the attacks. But then he was informed about a new Allied invention. Codenamed Window, it consisted of clouds of aluminium foil strips dropped from an aircraft. As the foil fell, it jammed any radar system. It promised to cripple the German air defenses. Harris seized on it. And 4 months after the Essen raid, in July 1943, he went back on the offensive. He called it Operation Gomorrah. The target this time was the industrial port of Hamburg. Bombers equipped with Window jammed the German radar. Other aircraft dropped incendiary bombs. A giant firestorm engulfed the city center. "40,000 people died, and 500,000 were made homeless. More raids on the port followed. It was an enormous shock to the German people. Four months later, in the autumn of 1943, Harris followed Hamburg with a series of attacks on Berlin. But by now, the Germans were learning to overcome the effect of Window, and by spring 1944, British losses were back at nearly 1 plane in 10. Worse, there was no sign German civilian morale was cracking. Harris's carpet bombing campaign was just not working. But neither was the American alternative of targeting infrastructure. By the spring of 1943, US Army Air Force daylight raids were steadily reaching deeper into Germany. But American losses were climbing. Around 1 in every 15 planes was being shot down. Yet undaunted, the American command now launched an attack on factories in the German towns of Regensburg and Schweinfurt. It was hugely ambitious. Both were deep in southern Germany, far beyond the range of US escort fighters. It was a disaster. The 380 flying fortresses, which US bomber chiefs had assured everybody wouldn't need a fighter escort, were harried and shot down. The loss rate was over 16%. The US was forced to suspend its bombing campaign. The war in the air had reached stalemate, and there was still no sign of it helping to usher in a victory. Then, in the early summer of 1944, as the Allies prepared to invade mainland Europe, the British and American air forces were tasked with disrupting German communication lines and oil supplies. It represented a return to targeted infrastructure bombing. But this time, the Allies had a new weapon. The British had experimentally modified a US fighter, the P-51 Mustang. The US engine had been replaced by a British-made Rolls-Royce Merlin. It gave the plane a much longer range. It was the ideal long-distance bomber escort. The Allied bombers hit bridges and roads leading to the German front in France with almost surgical precision. Oil supplies to the German military were drastically reduced. Once again, the German fighters attacked, but they were now outmaneuvered by the Mustang. Much of the German Air Force, now running low on fuel, was grounded. The campaign of targeted bombing on Germany's infrastructure may not have been the knockout blow the Allies hoped for, but it was finally paying dividends. But one man was not impressed. Bomber Harris was still obsessed with the idea that ever more devastating carpet bombing attacks would stop Germany in her tracks once and for all. So it was that in late 1944, Britain returned to carpet bombing. German city after city was hit and devastated. Then, in February 1945, Harris attacked Dresden, a city with virtually no military significance. The city's civilian population had been inflated by refugees fleeing bombing raids elsewhere. Yet Harris seems to have had no regard for civilian life. The city was flattened. Some 50,000 people died. It was a raid too far. Finally, questions began to be asked about the morality, let alone the efficacy, of carpet bombing. Whatever it had achieved, it had been done at an horrendous cost of civilian and military lives. Critically, it had failed to break German morale, yet 60% of RAF crews had died before they had completed 30 missions. For all the hopes put in it, carpet bombing had not come up with the knockout blow. The Germans, meanwhile, had put their faith in an altogether different technology to give them the knockout blow they needed to win the war. For Germany, Britain was a problem. It was an island, and for once Hitler's formidable land forces were useless. Britain also had a much more powerful navy. Yet Hitler calculated that if he used what he had strategically, he could fatally disrupt the sea convoys that were keeping Britain supplied with everything from oil to food. In the first 18 months of the war, German raiders sank more than 130 British merchant vessels. Some of the most effective raiders were the so-called pocket battleships, small but powerful warships designed in the 1930s to circumvent restrictions imposed on German rearmament after World War I. One, the Graf Spee, became particularly notorious. In a matter of weeks, she sank 9 Allied merchant ships in the South Atlantic before being cornered off the River Plate in South America and Scotland. But the raids were taking a serious toll. If the losses continued to rise, Britain would have real supply problems. Then, in early spring 1941, Germany's first and only 2 full-sized battleships completed their sea trials. They sent a shiver through the British Navy. Their potential for destruction was enormous. First into action was the Bismarck. In May, RAF reconnaissance aircraft spotted her in the Norwegian port of Bergen, trying to sneak out into the North Atlantic. The British Navy set off in pursuit. 2 days later, the Bismarck was sighted in the North Atlantic. Britain's latest battleship, the Prince of Wales, was sent to intercept her. With her was the British battlecruiser, Hood. Early on May the 24th, 1941, the 2 forces met. It was the first time the 2 sides' battleships had squared up to each other. Almost immediately, a shell from the Bismarck plunged through the weak deck armor of the Hood. It penetrated one of the aft magazines. There was a huge explosion. Only 3 of the Hood's 1,200 crew survived. The Prince of Wales, now outnumbered, retreated. It was round 1 to the Bismarck. 2 days later, Bismarck was spotted again, this time far to the south,